Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep into Bitcoin today, specifically its potential as a currency and its role in those cross-border flows.
Mm.
And, our listeners are experienced investors, so we've gathered a whole bunch of sources to really get into the nitty-gritty of this whole thing.
Absolutely. We've got some great stuff to dig into. We're looking at the Week on Chain newsletter, which analyzes that Bitcoin price rally we've seen. Oh, and we've also got an academic paper, Bitcoin and Shadow Exchange Rates, it's called. Pretty interesting. And of course, no Bitcoin deep dive would be complete without Satoshi Nakamoto's original white paper, right?
Yeah, got to have that one.
And to round things out, we've got a few reports from the Bank for International Settlements and the IMF. Should give us a nice, well-rounded perspective.
Okay, so let's get started with something fundamental here. How are these cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoin, different from the traditional financial systems? The ones we're all used to.
Well, the big thing with cryptocurrencies is that they operate on decentralized networks. That basically means no central authority controls them, like a government or a bank. They use this thing called distributed ledger technology, or DLT for short, which is essentially a shared database. It records all transactions across a whole network of computers.
Ah, so it's all out in the open.
Yeah, making it, in theory at least, tamper-proof and transparent.
Interesting. So we're shifting trust from those big institutions to the technology itself.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, the Week on Chain newsletter has been highlighting Bitcoin's recent price rally. They're attributing it to strong spot demand and all those institutional inflows. They even mentioned a surge in, get this, U.S. spot ETFs and CME futures open interest. What's driving all this institutional interest?
Well, a few things are happening. The anticipation of a more crypto-friendly environment, especially in the US, has really been encouraging for institutional investors. They're starting to dip their toes in.
Makes sense.
Plus, there's this growing view of Bitcoin as a potential hedge against inflation and all that geopolitical uncertainty.
Interesting. But does all this institutional adoption really mean Bitcoin has what it takes to be a proper currency? The BIS report, the one we have, it's pretty critical of cryptocurrencies in that regard.
Yeah, the BIS definitely raises some concerns about Bitcoin's limitations as money. They argue that scalability, or rather the lack of it, the stability of its value and trust and payment finality, those are some serious hurdles to overcome.
They specifically point to the limited transaction processing capacity of Bitcoin's blockchain. How does that limited scalability compare to the sheer volume of transactions that traditional systems handle? Like the big guys.
It's a big difference. Bitcoin's blockchain can only process a limited number of transactions per second, far fewer than systems like Visa or MasterCard, which can handle thousands. That's a major challenge for Bitcoin if it wants to be used for everyday transactions on a large scale.
Yeah, that makes sense.
For example, think about those peak shopping days, like Black Friday. Traditional payment systems have to handle massive spikes in volume. Bitcoin just isn't there yet.
Okay, so there are definitely some hurdles there. The BIS report also draws parallels with historical private banking experiences. They argue that just issuing tons of new money rarely leads to stability. How does that historical context apply to Bitcoin?
Well, the BIS is basically saying that Bitcoin, being decentralized and without a central authority to manage its supply, makes it prone to volatility. They point out that historically, private currencies that lacked strong institutional backing, they often faced instability. That undermined their effectiveness as a medium of exchange.
So while Bitcoin might be showing potential as an investment, its limitations as a currency are still up for debate. This IMF working paper we have, it actually delves into Bitcoin's role in cross-border flows. That seems to operate outside those traditional systems the BIS is concerned about.
Yes, this paper, it's called A Primer on Bitcoin Cross-Border Flows, Measurement and Drivers. It uses data from a few sources, blockchain data, Chainalysis, and local Bitcoin's data to analyze how Bitcoin is being used across borders.
One interesting finding is that there's this positive correlation between on-chain Bitcoin flows, the ones tracked by Chainalysis, and the VIX. That's that measure of market volatility, right? What does that correlation suggest about Bitcoin's use in cross-border flows?
It could suggest a flight to safety during those times of global uncertainty. So when traditional markets get all volatile, some investors might turn to Bitcoin as a hedge, moving assets across borders using Bitcoin to find what they perceive as a safe haven.
The paper also makes this distinction between on-chain and off-chain flows. It highlights that local Bitcoin's flows, which are off-chain, are way more sensitive to Bitcoin's parallel rate premium. Can you break down that distinction for us, and why is it significant?
Sure, On-chain flows, those are transactions that are recorded directly on the Bitcoin blockchain, totally publicly auditable. Off-chain transactions, like what you see on local Bitcoins, happen outside the main blockchain. So they occur on separate platforms or even through private agreements. The fact that they're sensitive to the parallel rate premium suggests that people are using Bitcoin to get around capital controls, specifically in countries where the official exchange rate is super different from the black market rate.
So Bitcoin is enabling people to move their money outside the traditional channels, bypassing restrictions. That could potentially impact a country's financial stability, right?
It's a possibility.
Okay. This brings us to the Liquid Network and the Breeze SDK, technologies that are supposed to make Bitcoin even better for cross-border transactions.
Right. The Liquid Network is like a sidechain to Bitcoin. It operates as a separate blockchain, but it's pegged to Bitcoin's value. What that does is allow for faster transactions and more confidential ones, which are really important for cross-border payments.
And where does the Breeze SDK fit in?
The Breeze SDK is basically a set of tools for developers. They can use it to build applications on top of the Liquid Network, so expanding its functionality and hopefully driving adoption for all kinds of things, like cross-border payments and settlements.
These technologies seem to tackle some of those limitations the BIS was talking about. What do you think their impact will be on Bitcoin's role in cross-border flows?
Well, they have potential, especially in terms of speed and privacy, which, like I said, are super important for cross-border payments. But, adoption is still limited, and we're still waiting on some clear regulatory guidelines.
Fair enough. Turning back to the fundamentals here, Satoshi Nakamoto's white paper, the OG Bitcoin document, it outlines all the security mechanisms. Super crucial for any financial system, especially one designed for these kinds of transactions. It explains this thing called the proof-of-work consensus mechanism. Can you explain how that works and how it keeps Bitcoin secure?
Okay, so proof of work is a system where miners, they compete to solve these really complex math problems. And by solving them, they validate transactions and get to add them to the blockchain. The first miner to solve the problem, they add the block of transactions and get rewarded with newly created Bitcoin. It's like a race.
So how does this whole process make the network more secure?
The fact that it takes so much computational power to solve these problems, that's what makes it really hard for someone to manipulate the blockchain. The more miners you have, the more secure the network becomes.
So because mining is decentralized, with tons of participants competing, it's basically impossible to mess with the system.
Right.
The white paper does mention one potential weakness, though. A 51% attack. What's that all about?
Okay, so a 51% attack happens when one entity, like a person or a group, they manage to control over half of the network's computing power. If they can pull that off, they could potentially double spend Bitcoin, reverse transactions, and basically wreak havoc on the network.
How likely is that kind of attack, given that Bitcoin mining is so spread out?
Honestly, the probability of a 51% attack, it gets smaller and smaller as the network grows. As more miners join and the computational power increases, pulling off that kind of attack gets really expensive and really difficult, almost impossible.
So it's a threat, but not a very realistic one.
Exactly. No system is perfect, but Bitcoin's design and the growing network of miners make it super secure.
That's good to hear, especially for anyone thinking of using Bitcoin for cross-border payments.
It really is. I mean, security is like the foundation, right? Especially if we're talking about global adoption.
Okay, so let's get down to the nuts and bolts of these transactions.
Yeah.
How does a Bitcoin transaction actually work in practice?
Yeah.
What makes those payments secure and tamper-proof?
All right, so at its heart, a Bitcoin transaction is simply a transfer of value from one Bitcoin address to another. Each address has this unique public-private key pair.
Public and private keys, right?
Yeah, the private key, that's like your secret code. Only the owner of the address knows it. But the public key, that can be shared with anyone.
So the public key is like your account number, and the private key is like your PIN.
That's a pretty good analogy. To start a transaction, you use your private key to digitally sign a message. This message basically authorizes the transfer of a specific amount of Bitcoin from your address to another.
And that digital signature, that's what proves that you're the real owner of the Bitcoin, right? Like you're not trying to spend someone else's.
You got it. That signature can be verified using your public key, making sure that no one else can spend your Bitcoin without your private key.
Okay, so how does this transaction actually get recorded on the blockchain, like permanently?
So the transaction gets broadcasted to the entire Bitcoin network. The miners, they grab it and try to include it in a block of transactions. They're always trying to add these blocks to the blockchain. It's like a puzzle. Once a miner solves a proof of work problem and adds their block to the chain, that's when the transaction is confirmed. It's official.
So the more confirmations a transaction gets, the more secure it becomes.
You got it. Each confirmation represents another block that's been added to the chain, on top of the one that contains your transaction. This makes it insanely hard to reverse the transaction. After about 6 or more confirmations, it's practically impossible to undo, set in stone.
So proof of work, it's securing the entire network and individual transactions, making sure that the whole record is tamper-proof.
Exactly. It's like a system that timestamps transactions and embeds them into this chronological chain of blocks. And it's virtually impossible to change. This immutability, that's a key feature, especially for anything that requires a ton of trust and transparency.
The IMF paper, the one we were talking about earlier, it mentioned Bitcoin's potential to sidestep capital controls, particularly with those off-chain transactions on platforms like local Bitcoins. Can you unpack that a bit? What are capital controls and how does Bitcoin mess with them?
Sure. So capital controls, those are measures that governments put in place to restrict the flow of money in and out of a country. They're usually trying to stabilize the economy, manage exchange rates, or prevent capital flight.
Usually happens in countries with unstable economies or political situations, right?
Exactly.
So the IMF paper is saying that Bitcoin gives people a way to get around these controls.
Yeah, they observed a correlation between Bitcoin leaving countries with strict capital controls and a big difference in the parallel rate premium.
The parallel rate premium, that's the difference between the official exchange rate and the rate on the black market, right?
Right. So if the official exchange rate for the Argentine peso is 100 pesos to the US dollar, but on the black market, you can get 150 pesos to the dollar. That difference is the parallel rate premium.
Gotcha. So when that difference gets bigger, meaning there's a big gap between the official and unofficial rates, the IMF paper is seeing more Bitcoin leaving those countries through platforms like local Bitcoins.
Right. People might be using Bitcoin to get a better exchange rate for their money, working around the official system.
That implies that they're using Bitcoin to move their money more freely, potentially impacting a country's financial stability and policies.
Yeah, it's a use case that's caused some debate for sure. Bitcoin's ability to, let's say, facilitate capital flight from countries with restrictive economic policies, that obviously raises some eyebrows with governments and regulators.
Okay, let's zoom back in on the tech itself. The white paper, it briefly touches on this idea of permissionless distributed ledger technology. Can you explain what that means and maybe contrast it with the permissioned kind?
Okay, so permissionless DLT, like the kind Bitcoin uses, is completely open. Anyone can join. You don't need some central authority to say, hey, you can join the network or you can participate.
It's like a free-for-all.
Basically, that's what makes Bitcoin decentralized and theoretically resistant to censorship. No one can tell you what to do.
So anyone with an internet connection could theoretically become a Bitcoin miner.
Totally. It's a truly open system. Now, this openness does come with some challenges. Scalability is one, right? And achieving consensus across such a massive network can get complicated.
And how's that different from permission DLT?
Permission DLT, it's way more controlled. Access to the network and participation, it's restricted. Only authorized folks can get in. It's more centralized.
So like a private blockchain that a group of banks might use to settle transactions amongst themselves.
Exactly. Everyone's known and trusted. That can make the system more efficient and maybe even more secure in some cases. But you do sacrifice some of that decentralization and censorship resistance that you get with permissionless systems.
So each approach has its own pros and cons.
For sure. Permission DLT might be a good fit for certain applications, especially in finance, where you need controlled access and streamlined processes. But for something like Bitcoin, a global censorship-resistant system, permissionless is more aligned with its core principles.
Makes sense. Going back to Bitcoin's role in cross-border flows, are there any real-world examples of its usage, something that can illustrate its potential and its limitations?
Definitely. We're seeing some remittance companies using Bitcoin to make cross-border payments faster and cheaper, especially in areas where traditional financial services are hard to come by.
So Bitcoin could disrupt the remittance market, the one currently dominated by companies with those high fees.
It has the potential. By using Bitcoin's decentralized nature and lower transaction fees, those remittance companies can offer a much more competitive service, especially helpful for migrant workers sending money back home to their families.
But Bitcoin's price, it's so volatile. That could be a big problem for these companies, right? What if someone sends a remittance in Bitcoin and the value drops a ton before the recipient can exchange it for their local currency?
That's a valid concern. That volatility, it can really impact the value of remittances. It might not be the best option for people who need those stable, predictable transfers.
So the stability issue, the one that BIS brought up, it's also relevant for remittances. Are there any other interesting use cases for Bitcoin in cross-border transactions?
International trade is another one. We're seeing businesses experiment with using Bitcoin to settle payments for goods and services across borders. They're trying to bypass the traditional banking systems with all their fees and delays.
Sounds like a direct challenge to the SWIFT system, that big network for international bank transfers.
It could be. Faster settlement times, lower costs, but, wider adoption, it's facing hurdles. Regulatory uncertainty, the whole volatility issue, those are still big factors.
So these real-world examples, they really highlight both the potential and the challenges of using Bitcoin for cross-border flows. It really feels like Bitcoin's role in these cross-border flows is changing so fast, creating all these opportunities, but also challenges for everyone involved.
Yeah, it's a wild ride for sure. Individuals, businesses, regulators, everyone's trying to keep up.
And adapt. Let's circle back to that IMF working paper for a sec. They talked about on-chain flows and that positive correlation with the VIX, suggesting that investors might be using Bitcoin as a hedge, when the markets get all volatile. Could you unpack that a little more?
Sure. So basically what they found is that when things get uncertain globally and traditional markets start fluctuating, some investors turn to Bitcoin, kind of like a safe haven asset.
Like gold.
Exactly. Gold is often seen as a hedge against economic turmoil. And this correlation between Bitcoin flows and the VIX, it kind of supports that idea. Maybe there's a similar flight to safety happening in the crypto world.
Interesting. The paper also highlighted how sensitive those off-chain local Bitcoin's flows are to Bitcoin's parallel rate premium. What's the takeaway there? Especially in the context of capital controls.
Right. So that parallel rate premium, it basically reflects the difference between the official exchange rate and the rate on those unofficial markets. It often indicates that there are capital controls in place.
Makes sense.
And the sensitivity that they observed, it suggests that people in countries with those strict capital controls, they might be using Bitcoin to get better exchange rates,
Wow.
going outside those official channels.
They're working around the system.
Yeah, exactly. And that ability to bypass those restrictions, it really highlights how Bitcoin could be used to, let's say, facilitate capital flight. It challenges those traditional ideas of financial control.
So while Bitcoin has this potential for remittances and international trade, it also poses some problems for governments that are trying to manage their economies and keep those capital flows in check.
It's definitely a complex issue, no easy answers. Sometimes capital controls are necessary, to prevent those destabilizing outflows, protect a country's financial system, but they can also stifle economic growth and limit individual freedom. It's a tough balance. And Bitcoin, with its ability to bypass those controls, just adds another layer to this whole debate.
It's fascinating. So much to consider. As we wrap up our deep dive into Bitcoin and cross-border flows, what are the key takeaways? What should our listeners be thinking about?
Well, I think it's clear that Bitcoin is not just one thing. It's an investment. It could be a currency. It's a tool for moving money across borders. It's multifaceted. And while it definitely has limitations as a currency, scalability, volatility, those are still issues, its role in these cross-border flows is undeniable.
And we're seeing these new technologies pop up, trying to address some of those limitations.
Exactly. The Liquid Network, the Breeze, SDK, they're trying to make those transactions faster, more private, which is crucial for cross-border payments.
It's a constantly evolving landscape. What advice would you give our listeners as they navigate this complex world of Bitcoin?
Learn as much as you can. Be critical. The world of crypto is full of opportunities, yes, but also risks. Stay informed, do your research, and don't be afraid to ask questions.
Great advice. Approach it all with a discerning eye. And with that, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into Bitcoin and cross-border flows. Thanks for listening, everyone.
It was my pleasure. Always great to chat about this stuff.